This is the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. In this episode of the Power Sector Podcast, Kay Kaufmann is going to talk about her recent Electrify think piece on why, according to recent data, the U.S. has 1,300 gigawatts of electricity interconnected and generating power, but twice that waiting in queues to get online despite rapidly growing demand and what the White House calls a national energy emergency. Kay is a freelancing creator journalist and founder publisher of Electrify, the new newsletter covering the clean energy transition. In Kay's nearly 4-decade career in media, she was most recently Mid-Atlantic bureau chief and Washington correspondent for RTO Insider, and before that, wrote for the San Francisco Chronicle, Baltimore Sun, and Capital News Service, and created the energy beat at the Palm Springs Desert Sun. She also handled communications for Visa USA and the Smart Electric Power Alliance. So, Kay, about this think piece, unleash the renewables, why the solar, wind, and storage projects we need right now can't get on the grid. Was it the White House's declaration of an energy emergency that made you want to dig into the lists of projects that have applied to connect to the power system? Those lists called the interconnection queues. Is that what made you want to do this?
No, that's background, Herman. But
Ah,
actually, in the article, I tell an anecdote about a recent off-the-record event where I was talking with a U.S. lawmaker and quoted figures from the Berkeley Labs queued up report 2024. That's where those figures, the 2,600 gigawatts waiting in the queues, that's where that came from. Um, and after that event, I realized that those figures were a year old.
mm,
And of course, like any good journalist, I want the latest and greatest figures.
sure.
So I started looking online, and the first place I went to, just like I wrote in the piece, is I put in queued up in Berkeley Lab. But
Yeah,
what,
great report. That's been the standard that I've always used.
yes, exactly. And the 2024 report was there. Actually, and if you look now, the 2023 report is no longer online. There's a landing page and a short summary, but there is no report. The 2024 report is still online. So I started looking and couldn't find anything. And at a certain point, decided it was time to reach out to folks at the Berkeley Lab, who, as I say, shall remain nameless. And they told me that, in fact, there is a 2025 report. It is sitting at DOE, waiting to be reviewed. Now, last year's report came out in April, which is why, kind of the red flag went up.
Yeah,
So that is how this whole thing started, is because it was, wait a minute, we're using year-old figures. What's going on? That's
yeah,
how the whole thing started.
interesting. And so after doing all that investigation and finally finding a source for some newer information, what did you find about the causes of the nation's backed up, I like to call them constipated interconnection queues?
All right, Herman, you know this as well as I do. But just to recap, the grid operators, the regional transmission organizations, and the independent system operators, they were organized in the 1990s when we had a very, very different electric power system, where generation was the big centralized turbines, coal, natural gas, yes, nuclear. And these grid operators, they set up their procedures for getting new power plants connected based on this kind of generation.
Right. It was a
And
lot
so they
simpler than
were
this.
only doing, maybe they were doing a handful a year. They weren't, that's how they were set up.
Load growth was for a long time pretty flat, so they didn't have to add a lot. And when they added these big bulk projects, so that were pretty easy to know what the product of the adding them would be on the system.
Yes, precisely. So fast forward to, when we first met and started covering energy in
A
the
long time
desert.
ago.
And all of a sudden, you've got all this solar and wind looking to get connected. They can build them fast, you know, and so the RTOs and the ISOs just because, as we know, in the electric power industry, regulation lags technology, often, very much. They
Mhm.
just weren't prepared. And they
And
started,
they didn't really understand it some time back when this all started. They didn't fully understand what the impacts of uh, variable generation like wind and solar would be and whether it would affect system operations, right?
they didn't understand that, and to this day, they don't trust it, as we know.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's intermittent, which means it's unreliable. It can't do the things, um, inertia, spinning reserves, all that stuff that they say is essential. And by the way, in the coming weeks, I'm going to be doing a piece on inertia to explain exactly what it is and what it isn't. But to this
And
day,
don't leave this out, Kay, and why it was a fundamental element in the failure of the Iberian Peninsula electricity supply a few weeks back.
well, that's up for debate. But in any event, so what the process was, and to a certain extent was until quite recently, is that the grid operators, they would have hundreds. The Berkeley lab, PJM interconnection, which is one of the biggest regional transmission operators, big grid operators, covers 13 states and the District of Columbia, Mid-Atlantic, Midwest, and District of Columbia, and Virginia, where all the data centers are.
Mhm.
They were doing interconnection one project at a time, first come, first serve. And that was not sustainable. Certainly, there were developers who would get a study and they would have to go back because the RTO or the grid operator wanted to revise the study. It could go on for years, which is
And,
why
and
things got backed up.
yeah, and PJM, by the way, is one of the ones that I hear most often named as reluctant to deal with variable generation. I think it's really important. Some people call it intermittent, but it's variable in the sense that it changes. But you know when it's going to change for the most part, so you can plan for it. If the grid operator, and PJM, like I say, is one of the more reluctant ones, um, is willing to make those plans. And in fairness, I got to say to PJM and to the other system operators and utilities that are, contributing to these backlogged internet connection queues, they are working to protect safety in their own way, maybe in a slow way and in an old-fashioned way, don't you think, Kay?
I believe, and I have said this elsewhere, utilities and grid operators, they really see their job first and foremost as keeping the lights on.
Right.
Reliability and, keeping it reliable, keeping it safe.
Yeah.
Keeping them on, and heaven forfend, they go off due to extreme weather or another emergency, getting them back up as quickly as possible. This
Yeah.
is their mission. They take it very seriously. But as you said, it makes them very wary of things they don't understand and of taking risks. And that's where things get difficult, shall we
Yeah.
say.
And I'm sure you remember, as I do, years ago, people said, oh, if we get 10% of the power coming from variable renewables, the grid is going to crash. And then there was 10%. So they said, oh, but if there's 20%, the grid is going to crash. And it didn't. And now we have times and places in California and other states where you get 100% of variable people still slow to adapt to this realization, aren't they?
Yes. Well, one of the things I do say in that article is if you look at the two state and goes back to the whole idea of an energy emergency. If you look at the two states that have had real energy emergencies, California with the wildfires and Texas with winter storms, how they responded beyond hardening their grid was putting lots of solar and storage online, and because of that, they have been able to ride out subsequent, heat waves and other things. So
Right.
they are moving towards a more flexible and dynamic grid, which is quite honestly, at least in my opinion, where we need to go.
Right. Now that brings us to the next question that you covered so well in your think piece at Electrify. Electrify. Um, you said that your most recent findings showed that some of the interconnection queues are starting to clear a little bit, but the emphasis is on the wrong kinds of generation. So what do you mean by the wrong kinds of generation, and why is this happening?
Data centers. In a word, we all know it.
Explain that to our listeners, please.
Okay. It isn't what's happening, and this, let me put in a plug right now for interconnection.fyi. This is a fantastic website that has been put up by two guys, Chris Talley and Stephen Zhang, and they are doing real time information tracking what's in the queues. It is a great, great resource. And talking with them, what they have seen is that, in fact, the queues are shrinking. What they are seeing online, their total for what's sitting in queues now is 2,000 gigawatts as opposed to the 2,600 gigawatts that were there at the end of 2023.
Okay, that's a good step forward.
That's a good step forward. Now, there are two things that are happening. One is that grid reform is happening. Instead of doing one-on-one, they're doing cluster studies. Instead of doing first come, first serve, you have to, show that you've got economic skin in the game, pay some higher fees, and also have reached certain development milestones so that they know you're serious.
Mhm.
And this has wrung some of the less developed or speculative projects out of the grid. I know developers don't like the term speculative, but that's part of the
That's what they are.
huh?
That's what
That's
they
part
are.
of that's part of the thinking. And because most of what's sitting in the queues is solar, wind, and storage, what's dropping out is solar, wind, and storage.
Mhm.
Now, the second thing is the data center bit. And as we all know, and I will speak a bit bluntly, the electric power industry is generally totally wigged out over this thing,
Yeah, yeah.
trying to get their arms around it. And the only way they can see to get their arms around it is putting lots of traditional generation, what they call firm dispatchable, 24/7. Natural gas, they want to keep coal online, nuclear, and hydro.
And
They,
that's the dirtiest, most expensive types of generation, I guess, which is why you call it the wrong kind of generation in your piece.
well, Did I say it was wrong? I don't think I said that, but
I apologize. I apologize. I surmised that. I apologize.
but there are two. PJM, which we talked about before, decided that it would do a fast track project. They called it their Reliability Resource Initiative. And they would open up the queue for certain kinds of generation, certain kinds of power plants that were the kind of power they thought was needed to keep the grid reliable, natural gas, nuclear, and storage. They are doing storage. Now, they announced this last October, and last month they announced the 50 some odd projects that have been cleared to be part of this initiative. That's 7 months
Mm,
compared to the years that some
right.
projects have been sitting in the queues.
That's good news.
Well, but most of what they have, they are expanding natural gas, adding new natural gas, and some of the nuclear that is coming back online and storage. No renewables.
Interesting.
Yes. The Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, known as MISO,
Mhm.
is also working on something similar, a fast track initiative. It hasn't been approved yet, but it's in the works. So what everyone is doing is saying, oh my God, we need power fast because the data centers are coming online super fast. So we just have to throw a pile of natural gas on the
Yeah.
grid. We got to
I think
keep the coal that we've got on the grid. And that is what, instead of saying, look at all this clean energy that can be built much faster and more cheaply. And if you pair it with storage, it can do pretty much whatever you need it to do. They're not doing that. It doesn't compute for them. And it's also obviously President Trump's energy emergency and the whole idea of energy dominance being linked to fossil fuels.
yeah. Okay. We better bring this to an end. The last question is I've got to hear the end of the story. You wrote about it in Electrify, but tell us what happened when you went to this federal lawmaker that you were talking to and you told him what you had found out.
As I say in the piece, he was a little bit dumbfounded at first. It really stopped him when I gave him those figures, and he understood what I was saying. And then, as a follow up, I asked him, look, if we've got just what I said, if we've got all this clean power in the queues, and if it's ready to go and can get online fast, shouldn't it come on first? And that stopped him a little bit as well. But a little bit hesitantly, he did say yes. Now, why this is important, and I shouldn't have said he, I'm sorry. That person, they,
Go
that,
ahead.
what was important to me, first of all, was the huge difference between what a US lawmaker will say off the record and what they actually do. Because, of course, we have just seen in the House of Representatives, and it will probably be the same in the Senate, Republican lawmakers whose districts have benefited from tax credits and incentives in the IRA. They say they support clean energy, but when it comes to the tax cut bill, they say, oh, yeah, we got to vote for it.
Yeah.
We can't not vote. We got to vote for it because we have to keep those tax cuts.
Yes, yes, that is true. By the way, I want to tell our listeners we are recording this on June 18. So you will find out that Kay has a foresight unmatched in the energy sector by the time you hear this. But that's all the time we have, Kay. I want to leave it there. Is there anything else you want to add real quick before we go?
Not that, only if I can do a quick plug,
Go
take a
ahead.
look online and subscribe to Electrify.
Lectrify, it's e/lectrify, lectrify. It's how you can find it. And it's a terrific read. The think piece she wrote since we agreed to do this was also interesting about the solar Olympics. Is that what it's called?
The
Solar
solar
decathlon.
decathlon.
Yeah, it's about young people competing to present innovative solar projects, right?
Yes, it
Okay,
was. Yep.
great. Thanks, Kay. I want to thank my guest, Kay Kaufmann. She's been describing, as she detailed in her recent Electrify think piece, why the US has twice the power waiting in queues, or not entirely twice anymore, but close to twice the power waiting in queues to get online, as the 1,300 gigawatts now generating electricity, and why recent efforts to address the problem by, by regulators and by legislators may be misguided. I also want to thank our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share with everybody you know our quest for energy transition solutions.